In a world of betrayal and power, Elliot Knight, a wealthy CEO, wakes from a coma to discover a deadly conspiracy orchestrated by his own family. With the help of Izzy, a devoted nurse who risks everything to protect him, they fight back against dark forces threatening to erase his life. As secrets unravel and trust is tested, Elliot and Izzy must navigate a web of lies to expose the truth before it's too late. Will they survive the storm? Where will their fight lead? Comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories. Izzy Wells adjusted the cuffs of her scrubs as she glanced down at the chart in her hands. It was another late shift at St. Jude's Hospital, and another night of caring for the wealthy and the fragile. Her eyes lingered on the name at the top of the paper, Elliot Knight. A man once known for his fortune, his empire, his power, now reduced to a comatose figure connected to machines that beeped steadily in a cold, sterile room. The accident had happened nearly 3 months ago, too brutal, too violent for a simple accident. But there was something strange in the whispers around the hospital, the way people exchanged glances behind his back. Izzy had been working at St. Jude's for over 4 years, long enough to know that men like Elliot didn't just end up in a coma by accident. The wealthy, the powerful, they had enemies, dangerous ones. Enemies who would stop at nothing to make sure a man like Elliot never woke up. She pushed open the door to room 312, her footsteps muffled by the quiet of the hospital floor. The room was dim, save for the pale light that bathed Elliot's still form. His face, once sharp with determination and strength, now looked like a mask of quiet defeat. His features were pale, almost ghostly, but the sharpness of his jawline and the strong set of his shoulders still showed traces of the man he had been before the accident. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and even in this state, even as he lay unconscious, there was something undeniably striking about him. A man who had once commanded boardrooms, a man who had been at the pinnacle of success, now reduced to this. Izzy exhaled softly, pushing aside the unease that always settled in her chest when she stepped into this room. It wasn't just the fear of what had happened to him. It was the weight of the stories she heard. The rumors, the way people whispered that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't an accident at all. But she couldn't let herself entertain those thoughts. Not yet. It was her job to care for him, to do her duty. And so, she moved quietly to his bedside, adjusting his IV drip and checking his vitals as she went through her routine. The heart monitor beeped in its steady rhythm, like a metronome, marking the passing seconds of his life. She paused for a moment, gently feeding the liquid meal through the feeding tube, making sure everything was as it should be. As she worked, a voice from the doorway made her pause sharp, cynical. "Still wasting time on him, Carter." Izzy turned to see Linda, one of the senior nurses, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed with a smirk on her face. Linda had been there long before Izzy, and she always had a cynical, almost jaded way of looking at things. "You do know he's probably never waking up, right?" Linda added, her tone dripping with disdain. Izzy didn't let herself react. She simply met Linda's eyes and returned to her work, refusing to be drawn into her negativity. "He's my patient. I do my job," Izzy replied quietly, her voice firm, steady. Linda let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "You really think he'll remember all this? Remember you," she continued, her voice tinged with bitterness. "If he ever wakes up, you're just another nurse, Carter. Just another nurse, Carter. Just another face." Izzy ignored the sting of her words, not letting them affect her. She didn't do this job for recognition or for praise. She did it because it was the right thing to do. Every patient deserved dignity, no matter their status. She finished adjusting Elliot's head, making sure he was comfortable, and for a brief moment, she sat by his side, her hand gently resting on his. She spoke quietly, as though confessing a secret, though she knew he couldn't hear her. "You're not just another patient to me, Mr. Knight. I hope you know that." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but filled with an emotion she hadn't expected to feel for someone she barely knew. She squeezed his hand gently. She squeezed his hand gently, standing up to finish her rounds, not knowing that this simple act of care would be the beginning of something far more complex. The night passed quietly, the steady beeping of the heart monitor filling the room with its almost rhythmic sound. Izzy went about her work, checking on her other patients, her mind occasionally drifting back to the man in room 312. She couldn't explain why she felt so connected to him, why her heart ached whenever she looked at him, why her heart ached whenever she looked at him. It wasn't pity. It wasn't just the care of a nurse for her patient. It was something more, something unspoken, something that felt like a bond, even though he couldn't respond. It wasn't until the third week of his stay that Izzy began to notice the smallest of changes. At first, she thought she was imagining it. A twitch of his fingers. A slight spike in his heart rate whenever she held his hand. But it kept happening, every time she touched him. And one night, after a long shift, the most incredible thing happened: tears. A single tear slipped from the corner of his closed eyelid as she spoke to him in the quiet room, the rain beating softly against the windows outside. Her heart raced in her chest as she looked down at him, unsure if it was a dream or reality. The mystery of Elliot night deepened. Izzy sat in the break room, her mind still lingering on the events from the night before. She had noticed more subtle signs of life from Elliot: twitches, irregular heartbeats, and even the flicker of a tear. Despite what everyone else believed, something was changing. She had felt it in her bones, but she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something darker was at play. The rumors surrounding his accident, the way people looked at him with a mixture of pity and suspicion, it all seemed off. And then there was Victor night. Izzy had always kept her professional boundaries, but something about Victor's visits made her uneasy. There was a coldness to him that sent a chill down her spine every time he came into the room. As she adjusted her scrub top, preparing to start her shift, she couldn't help but think back to the hushed conversations she had overheard in the hospital hallway. The director of the hospital and Victor, speaking in low, guarded voices, discussing Elliot's future, what little was left of it. The words lingered in her mind, indefinitely in a coma, and it's better for the company. Izzy's blood ran cold. She had always known that people like Elliot, powerful, wealthy, and influential, had enemies. But this was different. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was planned, cold, calculated. Victor, with his neatly pressed suits and carefully controlled demeanor, had always been a mystery to her. He'd visited Elliot countless times, but it was never about his nephew's recovery. It was about control, about power. Izzy had noticed it the moment he stepped into the room, the way he would stand so casually by the bedside, as if he were deciding the fate of the person lying there. She couldn't understand how someone could be so detached from the suffering of another human being, but Victor's indifference was clear. That morning, as she walked past the hospital director's office, she heard their voices again, louder this time, more desperate. She flattened herself against the wall, trying not to make a sound. If he doesn't wake up soon, the board will have no choice but to transfer power permanently. Victor's voice was calm, smooth, but there was a sharp edge to it. The director hesitated. But his vital signs are stable. He could still recover, he stammered. Victor's response was chilling. Or he could remain in a coma indefinitely. Isn't it better to let him go quietly? Izzy's heart raced as she listened, barely daring to breathe. The truth was out. Victor had been trying to ensure Elliot would never wake up, keeping him trapped in this silent limbo, all for his own gain. He wanted control of the company, and he was willing to murder his own nephew to get it. Izzy's mind spun the implications. This wasn't just negligence. This was deliberate. And it wasn't just Elliot's life at stake. It was hers too. She had heard enough to understand the danger she was in. She could no longer turn a blind eye. She had to protect Elliot. She had to stop whatever Victor was planning. Determined, Izzy's thoughts turned to action. She began to keep a closer eye on Elliot's condition. She monitored his medication even more closely, documenting every shift change, every nurse that came near him. Something told her that she couldn't trust anyone. She started asking questions, trying to get the truth, but every time she pushed for answers, she was met with silence. Her gut told her something was wrong, and her instincts had never failed her before. One evening, while on her night shift, Izzy walked into Elliot's room, only to freeze as she saw a nurse adjusting his IV bag. The nurse's hands trembled, just enough for Izzy to notice. It was a subtle movement, but enough to make her feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She approached cautiously, trying not to alarm the nurse. "What are you doing?" Izzy asked, her voice measured but sharp. The nurse looked up quickly, her face betraying her surprise. She tried to smile, but it was forced, stiff. "Just routine," she said, her voice unconvincing. Izzy's eyes narrowed as she examined the IV bag. Something wasn't right. She didn't have proof, not yet, but her instincts screamed that this wasn't just a routine checkup. She had seen enough to know that this wasn't the nurse's first time with Elliot. There was something deliberate in her movements, something practiced. Izzy's mind raced as she stepped closer, keeping her voice calm. "I'll take over," she said, her heart pounding in her chest. The nurse hesitated, her smile faltering, but she didn't argue. Izzy quickly moved in, checking the IV herself, feeling the tension in the room thicken. There was a faint smell of something strange in the air, but she couldn't place it. The nurse had already left by the time Izzy finished, but she was more determined than ever to find out what was going on. That night, as the storm raged outside, Izzy couldn't shake the feeling that she was racing against time. Something was happening to Elliot, something she couldn't yet understand. But she knew one thing for sure. Victor Knight would stop at nothing to make sure his nephew stayed unconscious permanently. And Izzy wouldn't let that happen. Izzy's hands shook as she checked the clock for what felt like the 100th time. It had been weeks since Elliot had shown any sign of improvement, but something inside her told her to keep watching. The days blurred together, and the silence in his room was like a weight, pressing down on her chest with every passing moment. Yet, amid the quiet, there had been changes, small but unmistakable. She had learned to read the faintest signs, the subtle twitches of his fingers when she held his hand, the slight rise in his pulse when she adjusted his position. At first, she had thought it was her imagination, but the signs kept coming, growing clearer, more frequent. Every time she touched him, every time she spoke to him, there was a quiet response, a flicker of life buried beneath the stillness. It happened again, one night, during another long shift, when the hospital was quiet, except for the constant hum of machines. The storm outside beat against the windows, the rain hammering the glass, filling the air with an eerie rhythm that seemed to match the beeping of the heart monitor. Izzy was exhausted, her eyes heavy, but she knew she couldn't leave Elliot's side. She'd grown used to the stillness in his room, the way the air seemed to hang around them, thick with unspoken tension. As she adjusted his blanket, something caught her eye. It was so slight, she almost missed it, just the faintest twitch in his fingers. She froze, heart racing in her chest. Her breath caught in her throat. Did he move? The silence seemed to stretch for an eternity as she waited, holding her breath, praying that it wasn't a trick of the mind. When nothing else happened, she reluctantly returned to her work, but the moment haunted her. She had seen it. She was sure of it. Over the next few days, more subtle signs appeared. His heart rate would spike slightly when she checked his pulse, a slight flutter beneath his eyelids when she whispered to him. It was as if his body was fighting to wake up, to return to the world, but still trapped in a prison of unconsciousness. Izzy's hope grew, though she knew better than to get her hopes up too quickly. She couldn't afford to be wrong. She had seen patients like Elliot before. Wealthy, powerful, with too many people around them who would stop at nothing to see them fall. But this wasn't just a job for Izzy. It was something deeper, something she couldn't explain. She had grown attached to Elliot, to the quiet moments they shared, even if he never answered her. There was something about him, something she couldn't shake, even when he was unconscious. One night, as the rain continued to batter the windows, Izzy sat beside his bed, the silence between them heavier than ever. She reached out to hold his hand again, and as her fingers closed around his, she felt it. This time, it wasn't just a twitch. It was a deliberate squeeze, faint but unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat. She glanced up at his face, the lines of worry and fatigue softening as she spoke in a low voice, her words almost a confession. "I don't know why I keep talking to you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I guess it makes me feel less alone." She watched him, waiting for any sign that he was truly there, trapped in a world of silence. Her voice dropped as she continued, the words flowing without thought. "When I was younger, I always dreamed of opening my own cafe," she said, her fingers tracing the edge of his hand. She chuckled softly, more to herself than to him. A little place with soft lighting, good coffee, and shelves lined with books. Nothing fancy, just a place where people could feel at home. She paused, her heart aching with the words she hadn't said aloud in years. But dreams don't always come true, do they? She let out a small laugh, shaking her head at herself. "I guess life had other plans for me." She looked down at their joined hands, as if hoping that somehow the simple act of speaking her truth would reach him. As she gazed at him, lost in her thoughts, she noticed another tear slipping from the corner of his eye. It was small, but it was there, unmistakable. Izzy's breath caught in her throat as she stared at him, her pulse racing. She had seen it. She had felt it, the connection between them, subtle but undeniable. She squeezed his hand gently. Speaking softly. "Can you hear me, Elliot?" Her voice trembled with the weight of the question, filled with both fear and hope. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. She watched his closed eyes, praying for even the slightest response. But there was nothing, no movement, no answer. Still, the warmth of his hand in hers was enough to make her believe that he was there, that he was fighting his way back to her. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The world outside the hospital, with all its chaos and dangers, seemed distant for just that moment. It was just her and Elliot, and for the first time, she dared to believe that he could hear her, that he was fighting to come back, and in that small, fragile moment, she made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't give up on him, no matter what it took. The next few days were a blur of unease and determination. Izzy spent every waking hour by Elliot's side, watching for any sign of change, no matter how small. She had grown more attuned to the subtle shifts in his condition, the way his heart rate would accelerate when she touched him, or the way his breathing seemed to steady whenever she spoke his name. These little signs, though fleeting, fueled her hope. But with that hope came a growing sense of dread. She knew that someone didn't want Elliot to wake up, someone with enough power and influence to make sure he remained trapped in this silent prison. And that someone wasn't just a distant threat. It was Victor Knight, Elliot's own uncle. The man who smiled to his face, but was ready to bury him if it meant gaining control of his fortune. Izzy couldn't ignore it any longer. She had overheard the conversation between Victor and the hospital director, the one she wasn't meant to hear, the one that confirmed her worst fears. If Elliot didn't wake up soon, Victor would make sure he stayed in that coma indefinitely. She had no doubt about it. But what she didn't understand was the depth of Victor's intentions. Was it just about the company? Or was there something darker at play? The more she thought about it, the more she thought about it, the more she thought about it, the more the pieces didn't add up. It was clear that Elliot had enemies, but to go so far as to keep him unconscious, to orchestrate his fall from power, it had to be more than just a corporate takeover. And now, she was part of it. She could no longer turn a blind eye. If she didn't act, Elliot's life would be taken from him quietly, insidiously, without anyone ever knowing the truth. With each passing day, Victor grew more brazen in his visits, acting as though Elliot's survival was a mere inconvenience. Izzy had always prided herself on being calm, composed, the nurse who did her job with care and without fanfare. But this was different. This was no longer just about taking care of a patient. This was about saving his life and her own. She needed to act quickly. That night, as the storm raged outside, Izzy returned to Elliot's room, determined to make sure nothing happened under her watch. The rain hammered against the windows. The rain hammered against the windows, the noise mixing with the steady beeping of the heart monitor in the background. It was as though the storm outside mirrored the chaos she felt inside. She walked into the room, a sense of urgency coursing through her veins. She knew something wasn't right, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. As she adjusted Elliot's IV, she noticed something strange. The nurse, who had come in earlier, had left in a hurry, her movements too rushed, too jittery. Izzy's eyes narrowed. Something was off. She felt a prickle of suspicion in the back of her mind. Was the nurse involved in the scheme? Had she been instructed to tamper with his medication? Izzy moved quickly, her heart pounding as she checked the IV bag again. The bag looked normal, but something felt wrong. She glanced at the clock. Time was running out. Izzy grabbed her phone and quickly dialed the number for the hospital pharmacy. Her voice was steady, but her mind was racing. She needed to know exactly what had been administered to Elliot in the past few hours, in case someone was trying to poison him. The seconds felt like hours, but soon she was speaking with the pharmacist, confirming the medication orders. Nothing stood out, at least not immediately, but she didn't trust it. Not for a second. There was too much at stake. She wasn't about to let her guard down, not when Victor was lurking in the shadows, waiting for his chance to strike. Suddenly, she heard a faint noise, footsteps approaching the door. Izzy's pulse quickened as she turned around, quickly shoving her phone into her pocket. She wasn't about to let anyone see her anxiety. The door opened, and standing in the doorway was Victor. His eyes met hers, cool and calculating, as though he had all the time in the world. He stepped into the room, the faint scent of his cologne filling the air. "How's he doing?" Victor asked, his voice smooth but laced with an undertone that sent a shiver down her spine. Izzy forced herself to smile, her nerves tingling with caution. "Stable for now," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm keeping a close eye on him." Victor raised an eyebrow, a thin smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Of course you are," he said, taking a step closer to the bed. "I'm sure you're doing everything you can." His words were laced with an edge of condescension that made Izzy's skin crawl. She could see the way he looked at Elliot, the way he treated him as if he were already gone, just a ghost of the man he used to be. "I'm sure you're very dedicated," Victor continued, his gaze shifting to Elliot's unconscious form. "But it must be exhausting, don't you think? Caring for someone who can't even recognize you?" Izzy's stomach tightened. She wanted to snap back at him, to tell him that he didn't understand, that Elliot wasn't just another patient to her. But she held her tongue, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. She couldn't afford to make a mistake, not now. Instead, she stepped back, giving him room to move. "I'll keep you updated on his condition," she said, her voice clipped. Victor gave her one last lingering look, his eyes calculating, before he turned and left without another word. As the door clicked shut behind him, Izzy let out a slow breath. Her suspicions had been right. Victor was involved and he was getting bolder by the day. But she wouldn't back down. She had to protect Elliot. For as long as she had to, she would stand by his side. Izzy couldn't shake the feeling that the walls around her were closing in. The weight of the storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside her mind. She had spent every moment over the last few days watching over Elliot, tracking his condition obsessively, her every instinct telling her that something was dangerously wrong. The small signs of life, she had seen his heart rate spiking ever so slightly when she touched his hand. The twitch of his fingers kept her going. But they weren't enough. She needed more. She needed Elliot to wake up, to speak, to give her something she could hold on to. She had made up her mind. She couldn't trust anyone in the hospital anymore, not with what she had overheard, not with the poison in the air that was slowly but surely closing in on Elliot. The night felt darker than usual, the hospital eerily silent except for the rain, which hammered against the windows with an urgency that matched the pounding in her chest. Izzy entered Elliot's room, her hand trembling as she pushed open the door. She felt the familiar mix of exhaustion and adrenaline, the kind of tiredness that was in her bones but couldn't slow her down. She had to be sharp. She had to make sure nothing happened to him tonight. She approached the bed, her breath shallow as she checked the IV line again. She had been so careful about everything, the medication, the nurses, the doctors tracking every movement, every change. The reality of what she had overheard, the conversation between Victor and the hospital director, the discussion about keeping Elliot unconscious indefinitely, was like a shadow she couldn't escape. Victor had made his intentions clear, and now it was up to her to stop him. As she adjusted the IV bag, she felt a cold chill sweep through the room, like the air had suddenly shifted. The low hum of the machines around her continued, but in the stillness, something else was there, something that couldn't be explained. She turned her attention to the heart monitor, watching the steady beat. But then, in the quiet of the room, the impossible happened. A faint, barely perceptible squeeze. Izzy froze, her fingers still wrapped around the IV tubing, her heart pounding as if it were trying to escape her chest. She could have sworn she felt Elliot's hand tighten. Just the slightest pressure, but it was enough to make her breath catch. For a moment, she thought it might be her imagination playing tricks on her. But then, there it was again, a flicker of movement. His fingers, just enough to confirm that it wasn't a mistake. Her pulse quickened, her hands trembling as she gently grasped his hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elliot, can you hear me?" The words felt foreign on her lips, too raw, too vulnerable, but she didn't care. She needed him to hear her, needed to believe that there was a chance, that he was still in there. The seconds felt like hours as she watched his closed eyelids, praying for the smallest sign, the smallest clue that he was still fighting, still with her. For a moment, nothing happened. The rain outside continued its relentless pounding, the storm showing no sign of stopping. And then finally she saw it. His eyelashes trembled, a soft flutter, and Izzy's breath caught in her throat. Her heart skipped a beat as she leaned closer, watching in awe as his eyelids flickered again. Slower this time, as if fighting against the weight of sleep, or perhaps something darker. Her hands trembled as she cupped his face, gently brushing the hair from his forehead. "Elliot, you're okay," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. "I'm here. You're safe." His breathing hitched, and then, like a miracle, his eyes opened. The world around her seemed to stand still, as if time itself was holding its breath. His gaze was unfocused at first, blinking slowly as he adjusted to the light, the confusion clear in his eyes. But then he looked at her, really looked at her, really looked at her, and Izzy could have sworn she saw recognition there. "Elliot," she breathed, her voice trembling. He blinked again, his lips parting as though he was about to speak, but only silence came. His throat was dry, strained as if he were struggling to form words. But the connection between them was undeniable. His eyes, clouded with confusion and pain, met hers, and in that moment, everything else faded away. The hospital, the storm, the looming threat of Victor, it all disappeared. There was only Elliot and the soft sound of his shallow breaths and the hope that she had held on to for so long, now tangible in the stillness of the room. "Izzy," he whispered, his voice weak, barely audible but unmistakable. Her heart slammed against her ribs, and for the briefest moment, she forgot how to breathe. He knew her. He remembered her. "I'm here, Elliot," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'm right here." She held his hand tighter, feeling the warmth of his fingers, the strength that was slowly returning to him. And in that moment, she knew they had crossed a threshold. Elliot was awake. The fight wasn't over, but it had begun again. And no matter what came next, she would stand by him, no matter the cost. The days following Elliot's awakening were a blur of confusion and chaos. His mind, though foggy from the long months spent unconscious, began to piece together fragments of memory. Each day he grew more aware of his surroundings, of the betrayal that had nearly taken his life. But there was something deeper, something nagging at him, a feeling that someone had been pulling the strings all along. His uncle, Victor, was at the center of it. All Elliot could feel it, but the details were still out of reach. He could barely remember the accident, the way the car spun out of control, the blinding headlights that had momentarily overwhelmed him before the crash. But he knew one thing for sure: something didn't add up. His accident had been no random mishap. Someone had wanted him gone. Izzy remained by his side every step of the way, even as his memory slowly returned. She was his anchor in a storm of uncertainty, a steady presence that kept him grounded. But even as Elliot found comfort in her, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. Victor had been so calm, so detached when he visited, and Elliot couldn't shake the suspicion that his uncle's presence was a sign of something much darker lurking beneath the surface. Victor had been eager to inherit Elliot's company, to take control of everything Elliot had worked for. But now that Elliot was awake, he couldn't help but wonder, was Victor the only one behind this plot? Or was there someone else? A shadowy figure in the background, pulling the strings. It wasn't long before Elliot's suspicions were confirmed. One afternoon, as Izzy was out of the room for a brief moment, Elliot's eyes caught sight of a familiar face, Harrison Hayes, Victor's brother and Elliot's estranged uncle. Harrison entered the room with that familiar air of authority, the same calm, controlled demeanor that had always unsettled Elliot. He was the last person Elliot expected to see, and yet there he was, standing at the foot of his bed like nothing had changed. "Glad to see you're finally awake," Harrison said smoothly, his voice as cool and collected as ever. There was no warmth, no relief in his tone. To him, this was business, nothing more. Elliot's eyes narrowed, a strange mix of confusion and suspicion rising within him. "What are you doing here, Harrison?" The older man smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm just here to make sure you're all right. Family comes first, after all." Elliot studied him carefully, but Harrison didn't give anything away. He was a master at hiding his true intentions, and Elliot could see it clearly now. There was no kindness in his face, no trace of the familial concern one would expect. Just cold calculation. "I'm fine," Elliot replied flatly, the fog in his mind slowly clearing. "But you might want to tell me why you're really here. You don't exactly seem like the concerned family member." Harrison's smile faltered just a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Elliot to catch it. The shift was subtle but telling. The facade of indifference dropped for just a moment, and in that space, Elliot saw the truth. Harrison was here because he had an agenda. He wasn't just checking on his nephew. He was keeping tabs on him, watching for any signs of weakness, making sure Elliot couldn't move against him. "You're not in a position to ask questions, Elliot," Harrison said, his tone darkening. "You're still recovering, still weak. You don't know what's going on. But trust me, I'm doing what's best for you, for the company, for the family." Elliot could barely contain the laugh that threatened to escape him. "You've got to be kidding." "Best for me?" His voice rose slightly, the anger simmering beneath the surface. "What's best for me, Harrison, is knowing the truth. What's best for me is getting the hell out of this hospital and making sure you don't take what's mine." Harrison's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes flashed with something darker. "You don't understand, Elliot. There are forces at play here, forces that you can't even begin to comprehend. You think I'm the only one who wants you gone, don't you? You're wrong." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Elliot's heart skipped a beat as he processed what his uncle had said. "You're wrong." The weight of those words settled in his chest, a chilling realization creeping up his spine. If Harrison wasn't the only one behind this, then who else was involved? And how far did this conspiracy go? Before Elliot could respond, Harrison turned and walked out of the room without another word. His parting words echoed in Elliot's mind like a warning. "You're not safe, Elliot, and you never will be." As the door clicked shut behind him, Elliot sat back against the pillows, his mind racing. Harrison had just confirmed what he feared the most. There were other players in this game, and they were coming for him, but he wasn't going to let them win. He had survived the accident, he had survived the coma, and now he would survive whatever came next. He would fight back. But first, he needed to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy, and he would need Izzy's help to do it. She had been by his side all this time, and now more than ever, he needed her strength, her loyalty, her love. Together, they would expose the truth and destroy the people who had tried to take everything from him. Izzy couldn't remember the last time she had felt this uneasy. The days had blurred together, each one melding into the next, as she watched over Elliot with unwavering dedication, her every action driven by the need to keep him safe. But now, there was a growing tension in the air, something more than just the looming threat of Victor and his cold calculations. It was the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. She knew they were both in danger, but it wasn't until that night, when the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly around them, that she truly understood the depths of the conspiracy that surrounded them. It started with a phone call. Izzy had just finished her shift, exhaustion weighing heavily on her, when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. The voice on the other end was familiar, but it wasn't the person she expected. "Is this Izzy Wells?" The voice was low, gravelly, tinged with a note of authority that made her skin crawl. "Yes. Who is this?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion. "I think you know who I am," the man said, a small, sinister laugh following his words. "You've been digging into things you shouldn't be, Miss Wells. I suggest you stop before you get in over your head." Izzy's blood ran cold. She hadn't told anyone about her suspicions, hadn't shared the private conversations she had overheard, or the strange things she had noticed about the people close to Elliot. But someone knew. Someone had been watching her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her voice steady, even though every instinct told her to run. "Oh, I think you do," the voice on the other end said, the amusement now gone. You've been poking around trying to uncover the truth about what happened to Elliot. But be warned, Izzy, you're not as safe as you think you are. And neither is he. The line went dead before she could say anything else. Izzy stared at the phone, her heart racing. She felt trapped, cornered in a situation that was spiraling out of control. It wasn't just Elliot's life that was at risk anymore. It was hers, too. Whoever had been pulling the strings behind the scenes was making their move, and they were making it clear that they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. She didn't waste any time. As soon as she could, she went straight to Elliot's room. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling against the windows, as if nature itself was trying to warn her of the danger ahead. She slipped into the room quietly, careful not to disturb him, though she knew he was still unconscious. Elliot had made small progress since the night he'd awakened. He was still fragile, still recovering. Izzy took a seat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. She hadn't told him everything. Not yet, but the time was fast approaching when she would have to. She couldn't protect him from this darkness alone. It wasn't just the plot against him that kept her up at night. It was the knowledge that she was slowly losing control of everything. Whoever had been behind this wanted to see him gone, and if she didn't act soon, they would succeed. As she sat in the dim light, her thoughts raced. She remembered the conversation she'd overheard between Victor and the hospital director, and the warnings she had received on the phone. There were powerful forces at play, and they weren't just after Elliot's fortune. They wanted control, absolute control. She wasn't sure how deep the conspiracy went. But she knew it wasn't just about money. It was about something much darker. That's when she heard it, the faintest sound. It came from the door, a soft creak that made her freeze. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned, only to find a shadow moving just beyond the threshold. Someone was watching her. Izzy's hand instinctively moved to the bedside table, where a small flashlight lay. She grabbed it, her breath steadying as she tried to remain calm. Slowly, she stood up and moved toward the door, peeking out into the hallway. For a brief moment, she saw nothing. Then, in the distance, a figure moved, disappearing into the shadows. It was a nurse, but not one she recognized. A chill ran through her. There was no reason for a nurse to be lurking in the hallway at this hour. Not unless they were here for a reason, one that didn't involve caring for patients. The pieces were coming together, slowly but surely, and what she had feared was becoming clearer by the second. Someone inside the hospital was working with Victor, or perhaps someone else entirely, and that meant Elliot's life was in even more danger than she had imagined. Without thinking, Izzy grabbed her phone and quickly dialed the number for the hospital's security. As she waited for someone to pick up, she glanced back at Elliot. His still form was a reminder of everything she was fighting for. She couldn't afford to let him down, not when he had come this far, not when they both had so much at stake. She had no idea what was coming next, but she knew this. Whatever it took, she would fight. She wouldn't let them take him from her, not without a fight. "Security?" the voice on the other end answered, sounding alarmed. "What's going on?" "I need someone to check the halls," Izzy said quickly. "I think there's someone here who doesn't belong." The fight had only just begun. Izzy's heart raced as the door clicked shut behind Harrison, his cold, calculating words echoing in her mind. She knew something was wrong, something much larger than just the power struggle between Elliot and his uncle. Harrison's parting words lingered in the air like a dark omen. "You're not safe, Elliot, and you never will be." The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the web of lies was far more intricate than she had first believed. There was no denying it now. Someone was trying to kill Elliot, and the longer he stayed in the hospital, the more vulnerable he became. She couldn't sit idle, not anymore. With every passing hour, the danger seemed to grow. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, had intensified since that phone call she'd received. She was no longer just a nurse, watching over a patient. She was a target. The shadows around them were closing in, but she wasn't going to let it end like this. She had a choice to make. It wasn't just about saving Elliot's life anymore. It was about exposing the truth. And if she had to risk everything to do it, then so be it. The storm outside raged on, its fury matching the storm brewing in her heart. She was about to make a decision that could change everything. Taking one last glance at Elliot, who lay motionless in the bed, Izzy knew that the moment had come. She couldn't let him be a pawn in someone else's game.
And yet another thing coming.
Izzy paced in the small, sterile hospital room, her mind working in overdrive. There had to be a way to stop whatever Harrison and his hidden allies were planning. The walls seemed to be closing in around her, but she wasn't about to give up. Her instincts had always been sharp, and now, more than ever, she needed them to guide her. As she moved toward the door to step out into the hallway, her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. She opened it hesitantly, her hands trembling as she read the words that appeared on the screen. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ms. Wells. Keep poking around and you won't like the consequences. Stay away from Elliot. He's not worth your life." Izzy's stomach churned as she read the message. The threat was clear, unmistakable. Whoever had sent it had been watching her, waiting for the moment when she would make her move. They were warning her, trying to intimidate her into staying silent. But that wasn't going to happen. Not now. She dropped the phone onto the bed beside Elliot, the weight of the situation settling over her. She couldn't back down. If she didn't act now, there might not be another chance. Izzy knew she had to make a move before it was too late. But this time, she wouldn't be alone. She had spent enough time working in silence, keeping her suspicions to herself. It was time to bring the fight into the light. She grabbed her phone again, her fingers flying over the screen as she composed a message to someone she trusted, someone who could help her expose the truth. She sent a quick text, her mind racing as she formulated a plan. It was risky, but it was the only option she had. She couldn't let Harrison and the others win. Elliot deserved better, and so did she. Izzy's pulse quickened as she glanced back at the door, listening for any sounds of movement in the hallway. She couldn't afford to be caught. With one last glance at Elliot, her heart aching for the man who had unwittingly dragged her into this nightmare, she slipped out of the room, her footsteps soft but determined. She moved quickly, making her way down the dimly lit corridor, her breath shallow in her chest. As she neared the security office, she glanced over her shoulder, making sure no one was watching. The hospital was eerily quiet, the storm outside masking any sounds from the inside. She stepped into the office, where a security guard was monitoring the cameras, oblivious to the storm of danger that was swirling just beneath the surface. "I need your help," she said urgently, her voice low but steady. The guard looked up, his expression neutral as he met her gaze. "What's going on?" he asked, sensing the urgency in her tone. "I need access to the security footage from the night of the accident. Everything from the traffic cameras, the hospital cameras, everything. I need to know what really happened to Elliot." The guard hesitated, but Izzy's determined gaze left him little room for argument. "I can't just give you access to that, he said, his voice lowering. "I know it's risky, but we're running out of time. Someone is trying to kill him, and if we don't act fast, we'll never get the truth." The guard glanced at her, sizing her up. After a long pause, he sighed. "All right, I'll get you what you need, but this better be worth it. As the guard began pulling up the footage, Izzy's thoughts raced. The pieces were falling into place. She had everything she needed to bring down the conspiracy. All she had to do was expose the truth before it was too late. The weight of the plan hung heavily in the air as Izzy stood by Elliot's bedside, her mind racing through the decisions she had just made. They were both running out of time. The threat that had been looming over them for weeks had only grown stronger since that phone call. Every word, every glance from Harrison had made it clear. They were being watched. They weren't safe here, not in the hospital, not anywhere. Victor's influence had stretched far beyond what Izzy had ever imagined, and now it was clear that there was more to this than just corporate greed. It was about control, about eliminating anyone who stood in the way. And Elliot was the last obstacle to Harrison's plan. Izzy was no fool. She knew the danger she was in, and she knew it wasn't just a matter of getting Elliot out of the hospital. It was about taking back their lives, exposing the conspiracy that had nearly cost Elliot everything. But the pieces of this puzzle were scattered, hidden behind a veil of lies and manipulation. With Harrison's subtle threats still fresh in her mind, she had no intention of waiting for the next move to be made against them. She had to take action, and she needed Elliot to trust her completely. When Elliot had awakened, confusion had clouded his eyes, but something else lingered beneath the fog, something Izzy had never seen in him before. He wasn't the powerful businessman he once was, but in the stillness of that hospital room, Izzy had seen the resolve in his eyes. He wasn't going to just lie there and let the world take everything from him. He was fighting back, and Izzy would be right there with him. "Elliot," she whispered, gently squeezing his hand, her voice soft but firm. "We have to get out of here. Tonight." He looked at her, his gaze struggling to focus, his brow furrowed with exhaustion.
Can't leave yet. I can't leave yet.
Izzy took a deep breath, her heart racing as she knelt beside him, keeping her voice steady despite the fear that bubbled within. "Harrison knows you're awake. He's trying to finish what he started. He's not going to stop until you're gone. We can't wait any longer." The words hit him hard, but the realization was instant. His uncle, the man who had always been in control, had taken it too far. There was no more pretending. No more sitting back while everything slipped away. Harrison had already made his move this time. Elliot wouldn't let him win. "I'm not just going to sit here and let him kill me," Elliot said, his voice rough but determined. "But we can't just walk out of here either. We need a plan." Izzy's pulse quickened as she leaned in, speaking in a low whisper. "I've already started making one. I've gotten a hold of the security footage from the night of the accident. It's all their proof that someone sabotaged your car. We just need to get it to the police before they can stop us." Elliot's eyes widened with disbelief. "You have the footage?" She nodded, her resolve unwavering. "Yes. I've already sent it to a trusted contact. They'll make sure it gets to the right people. But we have to move fast. We can't wait for the hospital to shut us down or for Harrison to make his next move." Elliot swallowed, his mind working quickly as he processed the gravity of the situation. "What if they catch us before we can escape?" Izzy smiled, a glint of determination flashing in her eyes. "They won't. I've already made sure the security footage is sent to multiple places. If they try to stop us, it won't matter. We've got back up, Elliot. You're not alone in this." For a moment, the weight of their situation seemed to lift, and a flicker of hope sparked in Elliot's chest. The battle wasn't over, but it had shifted in their favor. With Izzy by his side, he felt a sense of strength he hadn't known in months. This was no longer just about survival. It was about taking control of his life again. "Let's do it," Elliot said, his voice growing stronger, more assured. "Let's take back everything they've tried to take from me." Izzy nodded, standing up and moving toward the door, her eyes scanning the hallway. "We'll move carefully. The less attention we draw, the better. We leave now, and we don't look back." Elliot, despite his weakness, pushed himself to sit up, determination in his eyes. No turning back now. With that, they began to move, the storm outside raging as fiercely as the fire within them. They were about to confront the forces that had tried to crush them, and this time they wouldn't back down. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And this time, they would win. The night they decided to escape, the air was thick with anticipation and the hum of impending danger. The storm outside continued to rage, the rain pouring down in torrents, as if the heavens themselves were conspiring to obscure their movements. Izzy and Elliot had come too far to turn back now. They had made a plan, and it had to work. There was no other choice. As they carefully made their way down the dimly lit corridors of the hospital, Izzy felt a rush of determination. She had been fighting this battle from the moment she realized something wasn't right with Elliot's accident. But now, with Elliot by her side, the stakes were higher than ever. It wasn't just about saving him from Victor's machinations. It was about taking back control of their lives. Elliot's footsteps were slow, his body still weak from months in a coma, but his resolve was stronger than ever. Every movement he made, every step he took toward freedom, reminded Izzy of just how much he had already fought to stay alive, and she was going to help him win this fight. They passed the nurse's station, and Izzy's heart skipped a beat as she noticed one of the staff members looking their way. For a split second, she froze, her breath catching in her throat, but the nurse didn't seem to notice them at all. Izzy exhaled quietly, her pulse racing. They couldn't afford any mistakes. They had to stay undetected. They reached the stairwell at the end of the hall, and Izzy pushed open the door, the dim light from the emergency exit sign casting long shadows across the stairwell. They would take the back exit, the one that no one ever used, the one no one ever used, the one no one would be watching. Every detail of the plan had been meticulously thought out. If they were lucky, no one would realize they were gone until it was too late. "Ready," Izzy whispered, glancing at Elliot, who gave her a small but determined nod. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't backing down now, not after everything they had both endured. With one last glance around, they descended the stairs, their footsteps muffled by the storm. The outside world seemed impossibly far away, but Izzy didn't dare slow down. The exit was just ahead, and with it, freedom. But even as she reached for the door, her mind was already racing. She knew there were still dangers lurking, still enemies who would stop at nothing to keep them from escaping. Just as she was about to push the door open, she heard a sound, a door creaking. Her heart jumped into her throat. She froze, eyes wide, listening intently. Had they been spotted? Had someone caught wind of their plan? A shadow moved across the hallway behind them, and for a split second, Izzy thought they were done for. But the figure didn't approach them. It was just a nurse, walking down the hallway, unaware of the two fugitives standing in the stairwell. Izzy exhaled sharply, trying to calm her racing heart. With a final push, she opened the door, the cold night air hitting her face like a shock to the system. She glanced around quickly, making sure the coast was clear. They had made it, but there was no time to relax. They had moved fast, and they had to be careful. The safe house wasn't far, but it might as well have been miles away in the thick of the storm. Every raindrop that hit her skin felt like a warning, a reminder of how close they were to being caught. As they moved down the dark, deserted street, Izzy kept her eyes on the shadows, her instincts sharp. There was no telling how far Victor's reach extended, and she couldn't risk them being seen by anyone who might be watching. Every step felt like it could be their last. The adrenaline coursed through Izzy's veins as she turned to check on Elliot. He was limping slightly, but he was still keeping up, still determined to make it. The sight of him, fighting through the pain and exhaustion, made her heart swell with pride and fear. She couldn't lose him now. She wouldn't. They finally reached the safe house, the small, secluded property just outside the city. The familiar sight of the old, weathered building brought a sense of relief, but only a small one. The real battle was only just beginning. They had to figure out who else was involved in this conspiracy, who else was out there, waiting for them to make a mistake. Izzy unlocked the door, pushing it open with a quiet creak, and stepped inside, motioning for Elliot to follow. As she closed the door behind them, she knew that things were about to get even more dangerous. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. They had escaped the hospital. They had escaped the clutches of Victor and his schemes. But now they were going to expose the truth. And nothing, no one was going to stop them. The days after their escape felt like a delicate balancing act. Elliot was recovering, but the emotional toll of everything they had been through was still fresh, still raw. The weight of their shared secret Victor's betrayal, the conspiracy against him, and the lies that had nearly cost him everything hung over them like a storm cloud. But it wasn't just the danger of the outside world that they had to face. It was the uncertainty of what came next. They had escaped the hospital, but now they were on their own, in a world that wanted Elliot silenced, erased from existence. The quiet moments in the safe house, though rare, became their only sanctuary. Izzy watched him closely as he rested on the couch, his face drawn with exhaustion, but marked by a new strength she hadn't seen before. Every day, Elliot grew more aware of the world around him, of the people who had betrayed him, and of the battle that lay ahead. But in the rare, quiet moments they shared, something else was growing between them, something unexpected, something neither of them could ignore. It was a connection that had begun in the sterile halls of the hospital, in whispered words of comfort when he was unconscious, and now, in the shared silence of this small, secluded house. There was no pretense between them now. No games, no masks. They were raw, vulnerable, and yet undeniably drawn to one another. Izzy felt the shift every time their eyes met, every time their hands brushed. It was as if all the walls they had built around themselves were crumbling, piece by piece, until all that remained was the truth of what they had been through, and the truth of what they could become together. But it was terrifying too, for both of them. Izzy had spent so long guarding her heart, keeping it locked away behind the facade of a professional, detached nurse. But with Elliot, that mask was slipping. She found herself wanting more than just a quiet moment, more than just a quiet moment, more than just a fleeting glance. She wanted him, wanted to hold on to this fragile moment of peace before everything exploded again. One evening, after dinner, as they sat together on the worn couch, the weight of everything they had survived seemed to settle into the space between them. Izzy sat on the edge of the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, watching Elliot as he stared out the window, his thoughts clearly miles away. The silence stretched on, comfortable yet heavy. Finally, it was Elliot who broke the silence. His voice was low, hesitant, as though he was unsure of how to voice the thoughts that had been crowding his mind. "Izzy," he began, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes searching. "You've been by my side through all of this. You've risked everything, your career, your safety, for me. Why?" Izzy blinked, surprised by the question, though she had been asking herself the same thing for days. The truth was, she had never fully understood why she had done it, why she had thrown caution to the wind and defied the odds to protect him. It wasn't just because it was her job, and it wasn't just because of duty. It was more than that. It was the way he had looked at her, the way he had been there, even when unconscious. When nobody else cared, It was the quiet connection they had formed, piece by piece, in the silence of that sterile room. It was everything. She took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the edge of the couch as she carefully chose her words. "Because I couldn't stand by and do nothing," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "Because you deserve more than what they've done to you. And because—" She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should say the next part aloud. But she couldn't stop herself. "Because I care about you, Elliot, more than I ever thought I could." There. She had said it. The words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. She felt the heat rise to her cheeks, but she didn't look away. She couldn't. Elliot's expression softened, his eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and something deeper, something more vulnerable. "Izzy," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. He stopped, his words catching in his throat. The weight of what he had just heard seemed to settle on him, and for a moment he was speechless. The moment stretched on, thick with unspoken understanding. And then, almost as if it had been building for weeks, Elliot leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His hand reached out, gently cupping her face, his thumb brushing the tear that had slipped down her cheek. "I care about you too," he said, his voice steady but filled with a raw sincerity that left Izzy breathless. Before she could respond, he closed the distance between them, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative, as though neither of them could believe this was real. But as their kiss deepened, it became something more, a promise, a release, a connection they had both been craving without even realizing it. In that moment, all the fear, all the uncertainty, seemed to vanish. They weren't just survivors of a plot that had nearly destroyed them. They were two people who had found each other in the darkest of times, and in each other they had found something worth fighting for. The days in the safe house passed in a blur of recovery, tension, and strategy. The storm that had been raging outside seemed to reflect the turmoil within them both. Elliot, though physically still weak, was determined to regain control of his life, his company, and his future. Every morning, Izzy watched him, the weight of the past few weeks bearing down on him, but the fire in his eyes never dimmed. They knew the fight wasn't over. The conspiracy that had threatened Elliot's life still lurked in the shadows, and if they didn't act soon, they would lose everything. It wasn't long before they realized that getting the police involved wasn't enough. Harrison's influence had stretched further than they could have imagined, and even the authorities were at risk of being compromised. But Izzy wasn't out to give up. The evidence they had security footage from the night of the accident, the testimony of a trusted ally, was enough to bring truth into the light. They just had to make sure they could expose it without falling into the traps that had been set for them. Elliot had been quiet lately, more so than usual. Izzy had seen the toll the last few days had taken on him. He was unraveling the memories of his accident, piecing together the fragments of his past. Every day, more of his old self came back. But the deeper he dug into the truth, the more he found himself haunted by the question: who could he trust? He had been betrayed by his own family. His uncle, someone who had pretended to care, had been behind the very attempt on his life. What had started as a desperate need to survive had now turned into a need to reclaim what was rightfully his and to make sure no one else suffered the same fate. One evening, as the sun began to set and the storm outside began to ease, Elliot turned to Izzy, his voice tinged with both exhaustion and determination. "We can't hide forever," he said, his gaze unwavering. "We need to bring this to light, but we can't just hand it over to the authorities. They'll destroy it. We need to control the narrative." Izzy knew he was right. The system was broken, and they couldn't rely on it. She had seen enough corruption, enough injustice in her time as a nurse to know how easily people could be bought, manipulated, silenced. If they wanted to make sure Elliot's story was heard, they needed to take the power back. "We'll do it our way," Izzy said, her voice steady, resolute. She could feel the weight of the decision hanging between them, but there was no turning back now. We expose the truth, but we make sure everyone sees it. We take control of the information before they can stop us. Elliot nodded, his mind already turning with the possibilities. We'll make sure the footage gets to the media, make it impossible for them to ignore. And we'll make sure everyone knows the truth about Harrison and the lengths he's gone to. It was dangerous, no doubt. They knew the risks. If they exposed the conspiracy, it would be a war. Harrison would do everything in his power to silence them. But it wasn't just about Elliot anymore. It was about everyone who had been wronged, about taking a stand against the darkness that had been allowed to thrive in the shadows. The following days were a flurry of activity. They reached out to trusted contacts, allies they had carefully selected, people who weren't afraid to risk everything for justice. They worked quickly, organizing the evidence, securing the footage, and preparing for the moment when they would drop the bombshell that would shake everything to its core. Izzy found herself working alongside Elliot like never before. They were no longer just nurse and patient. They were partners bound together by a shared mission. She could feel her heart pulling in ways she hadn't expected. She had always been the kind of person who kept her distance, kept her emotions under lock and key. But with Elliot, everything felt different. He wasn't just a man to be saved. He was someone who needed her just as much as she needed him. And together, they were unstoppable. The night they decided to send the footage to the media was a turning point. Izzy watched as Elliot, more confident than he had been in weeks, sat at the laptop, clicking away, securing the final files. "It's done," he said, his voice calm, filled with the weight of what was about to happen. Izzy took a deep breath, her heart racing as she watched him. "Are we ready for this?" Elliot's gaze met hers, his expression serious. "We don't have a choice. We fight now or we lose everything." And with that, they pressed send. The information went live, the footage broadcasted to the world, and the fight began in earnest. They were no longer running. They were no longer hiding. They were finally taking control of their own fate. As the storm outside subsided, the storm inside Izzy's heart remained. But this time, it was a storm of hope. They had taken the first step. And no matter what came next, they knew they wouldn't face it alone. Together, they had the power to change everything. In the end, Elliot and Izzy's journey proved that the greatest battles are often fought not with weapons, but with the strength of resolve, the courage to face the truth, and the ability to trust in the people who stand by your side. No matter how powerful the forces against you may seem, the power of truth and determination can break through even the darkest of obstacles. Their story teaches us that standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible, is the key to reclaiming our lives and our futures. Trust in yourself, trust in those who support you, and remember that, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, there is always a way forward. At the same time, the story reminds us of the importance of honesty and transparency, especially when dealing with those in positions of power. The world may not always be fair, and justice might not come easily, but every truth shared, every small victory, can make a difference in the long run. If you stand firm and refuse to let fear control you, the impossible becomes just another challenge to overcome. So where do you stand? What's your next step in your own journey? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more gripping, emotional tales. Let us know where you're watching from and join our community of people who believe in the power of truth, justice, and perseverance.